to Cosmic Terror. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. The distant hum of failing life support systems fills the cramped cockpit. Emergency lights cast blood-red shadows across instrument panels. This was supposed to be a routine test. That's what they told me. That's what I told myself when I first noticed the anomalies in the mission briefing. I'm Chief Test Pilot for Quantum Propulsion Systems. 15 years of experience, 7 successful prototype flights through experimental propulsion systems that bent the conventional laws of space-time manipulation. I still remember the day Director Winters approached me in the simulator chamber, her eyes betraying an excitement her stoic expression tried to mask. "Captain Reynolds," she said, sliding a carbon fiber tablet across the console, "how would you like to make history?" The mission parameters they gave me were simple. Activate the drive, create a micro wormhole, travel 500 meters in physical space while bypassing normal size time, then return to the exact launch coordinates. Total estimated mission duration, 47 seconds. The brass called it a minor fold in the space-time continuum. Not actual time travel, just a shortcut through the fiber of reality, like folding a piece of paper to bring two distant points together. The technical requirements seemed straightforward. The mathematical models elegant. The quantum algorithms flawless, at least on paper. Just a quick hop from point A to point B, without traversing the distance between. The ultimate transportation breakthrough, but something went catastrophically wrong during transit. I experienced 6 hours and 23 minutes of subjective time in what my handlers insist was only 47 seconds of subjective reality. 6 hours of... I don't even have the vocabulary to describe what I experienced. 6 hours where I wasn't alone. What's worse is that now, 3 days after returning, the biometric scanners keep detecting 2 distinct life signs aboard my single-occupant vessel. 2 heartbeats, 2 respiration patterns, 2 brainwave signatures. 2 brainwave signatures. It started 6 weeks ago. Project Director Winters summoned me to the secure briefing room deep beneath Vandenberg Air Force Base, sub-level 7. A floor that doesn't officially exist on any base schematics. Military installations have always maintained these shadow facilities, but the Kronos wing was different. The air felt charged, like the moment before, and the walls were lined with classified schematics of the XST-9 Kronos drive system. Designs that seemed to defy. I arrived 15 minutes early, as was my habit. The room was empty except for Dr. Hamada, the theoretical physicist behind the drive's core algorithms. He was muttering to himself, staring at equations that scrolled too fast across his neural-linked tablet. When he noticed me, he startled visibly. "Captain Reynolds," he said, quickly deactivating his display, "you have experience with the QPS-7 engine series, correct?" I nodded. 3 test flights with the early prototypes, 2 more with the refined models after. He studied me with unnerving intensity. "And you experienced no temporal anomalies during those tests? No moments of discontinuity?" Before I could answer, the doors hissed open and Director Winters entered, followed by her security detail and 3 other pilots. The meeting was beginning. The titanium briefcase on the table contained what looked like a standard neural interface module, but with modifications I'd never seen before. Quantum entanglement circuits and biometric authentication protocols that seemed unnecessarily complex for a simple test flight. "This isn't just about faster transport, Captain Reynolds," Winters said, her voice dropping to almost a whisper as she activated the room's acoustic dampening field. "The Pentagon believes someone else has already achieved space-time manipulation, and we need to catch up before the room's acoustic." She didn't specify who someone else was, whether she meant the Chinese Quantum Research Division, the European Consortiate, or the private sector ventures pushing boundaries in propulsion technology. Her deliberate vagueness suggested something worse. 3 other test pilots sat silently around the table. Rodriguez, Chen, and Abernathy. All accomplished pilots, but none with my hours in experimental craft. Rodriguez fidgeted with his neural implant interface, a nervous tic I'd noticed during her previous collaboration. Abernathy seemed calm, but the slight tremor in his left hand as he reached for his water suggested otherwise. They were afraid, though they'd never admit it. When the lights dimmed and the holographic presentation began, I noticed subtle inconsistencies in the theoretical models, transit calculations that seemed deliberately obscured or incomplete. Critical variables shifted between slides without acknowledgement. Brabble 2 unmodified the baseline equations. Rodriguez fell silent as the transit diagram, where the mathematical prediction models simply stopped. The room fell silent. Rodriguez stopped his fidgeting mid-action. Bartley shadowed the board and changed imperceptibly. That evening, in the secure dormitory they'd assigned me, I couldn't shake the feeling that crucial information was being withheld. The test parameters made no sense without the complete theoretical framework. It was like being asked to fly through a storm with half the entry injection disabled. I accessed the mission files from my secure terminal, using the backdoor permissions still active from my work on the QPS-7 project. Most critical files were encrypted beyond my clearance. Medical scans showing impossible neurological patterns in primates post-testing, dual consciousness markers, overlapping brainwave patterns, memory engrams that didn't correspond to the test subject's experience. And then I found something truly disturbing. Mortality statistics that had been deliberately omitted from the mission briefing. Of the 17 primates that had undergone preliminary testing, 14 had experienced catastrophic neurological failure within 72 hours of return. The remaining 3 exhibited behavior patterns so altered that the reports classified them as non-Babylation entities. Against my better judgment, curiosity overcame my apprehension. Perhaps it was ego, the test pilot's conviction that skill and experience could overcome any technical challenge. Or perhaps something else was already influencing my decision-making, pulling me toward that inevitable first human test before anyone else could. The preflight procedure took 6 hours. Neural calibration, quantum field alignment, and endless equipment checks. As they sealed the XST-9 capsule and initiated launch protocols, Dr. Hamada approached for a final systems verification. As he leaned in to check the neural interface connection at the base of my skull, he pressed a small data chip into my palm. "If anything unusual happens in transit, use this," he whispered, his eyes darting nervously to the observation cameras. "And, Captain, remember that consciousness itself is a quantum phenomenon. What we perceive as reality is merely the most probable of many possible states." Before I could question him further, he was gone, and the sealed capsule began its pressurization sequence. I secured the chip in my suit's hidden compartment, designed for emergency medication delivery. Whatever information Hamada had risked his career to share with me would have to wait until after the test. I didn't realize then that after would become such a complicated concept. 15 minutes 30 seconds to drive activation. The pre-launch checklist complete. Monitoring systems green across all parameters. My pulse steady at 64 BPM despite the experimental nature of the mission. Years of test piloting had conditioned my autonomic responses to remain calm, even when my conscious mind recognized the danger. The initial activation sequence proceeded normally, exactly as we'd rehearsed in countless simulations. The quantum stabilizers pulsed with blue light as the space-time drive spooled up to critical mass, their harmonic resonance creating a perfect fifth interval that vibrated through the hull. The Samurai containment field indicators remained stable. Consciousness mapping protocols synchronized with everything within expected parameter. T-5 seconds. Drive capacitors at full charge. reality distortion metrics nominal, space-time coordinates locked for transit. Initiating final sequence, I reported to Mission Control. All systems nominal. Director Winter's voice came through with unusual clarity. Remember, Captain Reynolds, the transit experience may include sensory anomalies. These are expected and temporary. Maintain focus on your return protocols, regardless of subjective experience. At T-month 0, I activated the drive. The transition should have been instantaneous, a seamless fold in space-time with no perceptible moment of transfer. Instead, as the wormhole threshold formed around the craft, I noticed the first anomaly. The event horizon shifted from the expected ultraviolet glow to a deep absorptive black that seemed to swallow the instrument panel light. The darkness had texture, depth, almost like a liquid that flowed rather than a void. The quantum field visualizers displayed patterns that symbolized light. Telemetry still showed normal readings, all systems functioning within parameters, but the comms channel erupted with concerned voices from Mission Control. Field stability dropping to 87%. Dimensional variance exceeding safety parameters. Captain Reynolds, do you read? Emergency abort sequence, Tango Echo 3. The voices cut out completely as I crossed the threshold, replaced by a silence so absolute it felt physical, pressing against my eardrums. Inside what scientists had casually termed transit space, I experienced what no simulation had predicted, what no training could have prepared me for. Absolute stillness, coupled with overwhelming sensory input, as if I existed in multiple states simultaneously. I perceived colors beyond the visible syllable. The chronometer on the instrument panel indicated only 12 seconds had passed, yet I had already experienced what felt like hours of consciousness in this impossible liminal space. Time seemed elastic, stretching and contracting with my attention. When I focused on the control panel, seconds crawled by, but when my awareness drifted to the sensations coursing through my neural system, I remembered something odd then. A conversation overheard 3 weeks earlier between maintenance workers in the facility cafeteria. They had a name for this phenomenon. The long moment whispered about in break rooms after 3 previous unmanned test vehicles. The technician spoke of ghost data in the system logs, information that appeared and disappeared from storage drives, and equipment that aged months during 47-second tests. As I drifted in transit space, my neural interface began recording unprecedented activity in my temporal lobe, the data stream corrupting as memory engrams formed and dissolved faster than the system could process. Memories that weren't mine, began to surface. Experiences of the craft from previous tests, data patterns from system calibrations I hadn't perceived. The cabin temperature dropped suddenly to 15 dCers, despite environmental controls showing optimal functioning. My exhalations crystallized instantly. Frost formed on interior surfaces in impossible geometric patterns. Fractures that grew and evolved with mathematical precision. Then neural pathways, then writing in a script I almost recognized before it evolved. I attempted to follow emergency protocols, activating the retrieval sequence coded into the drive system, but the command console briefly displayed text in what appeared to be a language I'd never seen before executing the return sequence. The characters shifted and rearranged themselves, seemingly responding to my attempts before dissolving back into incomprehensibility. Communication systems remained dead. The navigation system failed completely. Displays showing conflicting positional data, as if the vessel existed in multiple locations simultaneously. The quantum positioning system indicated that I was simultaneously at the launch coordinates, 580 other points in between, as if the craft existed as a probability wave rather than a discrete gravity. Primary systems began shutting down one by one, circuit pathways overloading from quantum uncertainty states. I reached for the manual override, but my hand passed through the solid metal, as if it were mist before resolidifying when I pulled back in shock. I tried again, focusing intently on the physical nature of both the lever and my own hand, and this time made contact. The emergency power engaged automatically as the main systems failed. The auxiliary lighting activated, casting harsh blue illumination throughout the cabin. And that's when the auxiliary lighting illuminated something impossible. For a fraction of a second, I saw my own silhouette seated at the auxiliary control station, though I was alone in the craft. But a solid figure that turned slightly toward me before the lights flickered and it vanished. I felt a pressure in my mind, like the moment before understanding a complex equation. The sense that disparate information was aligning into a pattern just beyond my comprehension. Something was observing me from within transit space, something that had been waiting. The return sequence initiated automatically as emergency systems detected my elevated stress responses. The craft shuddered as reality reasserted itself, the quantum field collapsing back to conventional space-time parameters. The transition back was violent, consciousness momentarily separating from body as dimensional forces realigned. When I regained full awareness, the craft had returned to normal space, appearing precisely at the designated coordinates, as if nothing unusual had occurred. The chronometer showed exactly 47 seconds had elapsed since launch. All systems had returned to nominal function, but I knew something had gone catastrophically wrong. My hands were bleeding from fingernail marks in my palms, though I had no memory of clenching my fists with such force. My neural implant registered a 3.7% change in my brainwave baseline pattern, and most disturbing of all, the mission recorder showed intact footage of an uneventful 47-second flight. But my personal neural interface data, temporarily cached in my implant before synchronizing with the main system, revealed 6 hours and 23 minutes of experiential time. And scattered throughout that data were audio segments of a voice that wasn't mine, speaking in perfectly formed English, but with cadences and harmonic overtones that no human vocal apparatus could produce. The voice had only spoken 5 words, repeated at intervals throughout the lost hours. I see you. I am you. The debriefing lasted 6 hours. Technicians extracted data from the craft's systems, while medical personnel drew blood, cerebrospinal fluid, and tissue samples from me. Cognitive assessment specialists ran me through standardized protocols according to detect psychological changes or cognitive cognition scores had improved by 17%. According to Dr. Phillips. The kind of improvement isn't possible without enhancement drugs or neural modification, she muttered, comparing my results with previous records. The human brain doesn't spontaneously optimize its processing architecture. I was immediately placed in mandatory post-mission quarantine, standard procedure for experimental flights, but the heightened security and expanded medical monitoring suggested deeper concerns. The facility converted an entire wing into an isolation unit, with transperimental quantum field detectors positioned throughout the space. On the 3rd day of quarantine, Dr. Phillips discovered unusual brain activity in my parietal lobe, patterns matching those of patients with presence hallucinations, or the sensation of being watched. But unlike typical clinical cases, my brain activity showed perfect bilateral synchronization, with identical patterns mirrored in both hemispheres. Your cerebrospinal fluid shows elevated levels of exotic particles, consistent with quantum entanglement events, she explained, studying my scans with growing concern. The particles demonstrate properties similar to those found in the drive's containment chamber, but they're somehow maintaining coherence outside the stabilization field. There's no medical precedent for this. These particles shouldn't be able to exist in biological tissue, particularly in regions associated with self. The research team introduced laboratory mice into my quarantine wing for comparative testing to determine whether the anomalies were environmental or specific to my transit experience. Within hours, the mice began synchronized behavior patterns Unlike anything in the control group, all 12 mice would simultaneously freeze, facing the same direction at once, tracking something invisible across the room with their eyes. Their whiskers would vibrate in identical patterns, and their neural activity would synchronize, despite no external stimuli to explain the coordination. More disturbing still, when researchers removed tissue samples from the mice, they discovered the same exotic particles now present in my system had somehow transferred to the research animals, despite no direct contact between us. The particles appeared to proximity alone. Meanwhile, technical teams examining the XST-9 craft reported instrument anomalies that defied conventional explanations. Sensors occasionally detected 2 separate heat signatures in the cockpit, despite visual confirmation that it was empty. Environmental monitoring systems recorded localized atmosphere as if something unseen was moving through the cabin. The engineering team discovered that certain electronic components had aged considerably more than the mission duration would justify, molecular degradation consistent with years of use rather than minutes. Materials analysis revealed subtle atomic restructuring in the pilot's neural interface system. The crystalline matrix reproduced the effect. The quantum field disruption should have dissipated by now, argued Dr. Hamada during the review meeting on day 5 of my quarantine. The theoretical models predicted complete normalization within 17 echoes suggest something fundamental was altered during transit. Not just temporary exposure to exotic dimensional conditions, but a permanent change in the quantum state of both the biological and mechanical systems involved. Director Winters, flanked by 3 uniformed military officers I didn't recognize, dismissed his concerns with a wave of her hand. This is theoretical speculation without actionable intelligence, she said coldly. The project timeline remains unchanged. Captain Reynolds has experienced no significant health effects, and the anomalous readings fall within acceptable parameters for an experimental system. Engineering will resolve the technical issues before the next launch, with proceeding with preparations for a second test flight. The room erupted into barely controlled chaos, researchers arguing against rushing further tests before understanding the current anomalies, engineers pointing out critical system inconsistencies, medical personnel warning about unknown biological effects. But the decision had clearly been made before the meeting began. Someone else who Winters believed was racing to perfect the technology. That night, alone in my quarantine quarters but constantly monitored by cameras and sensors, I finally examined Dr. Hamada's data chip. My neural implant could interface directly with the storage device, bypassing the facility's network monitoring systems. What I found shattered any remaining illusions about the Kronos Initiative's data. The chip contained classified footage from the animal testing phase, not the sanitized reports shown during mission briefing, but raw, unedited documentation of the program's progression. I watched a chimpanzee, designated Subject 17, during its return from a test. The animal appeared normal for approximately 30 minutes, then began exhibiting impossible behaviors, solving complex mathematical equations, manipulating quantum probability fields around small objects, and communicating through an improvised symbolic language that the researchers struggled to decode. Genetic analysis of Subject 17 revealed altered DNA sequences, showing proteins and molecular structures that couldn't have evolved on Earth. Not mutations, but precisely engineered modifications that created entirely new cellular structures within the brain tissue. More disturbing were the infrared recordings of the returned test vessel, clearly showing two thermal signatures occupying the same space, occasionally separating before merging again, like oil and water briefly separating before recombining. The thermal imagers' movements suggested deliberate observation of the researchers examining the craft. I closed the files, my mind racing to process implications that challenged fundamental understanding of reality itself. Whatever had happened in transit space, it wasn't simply a transportation phenomena. The space-time drive wasn't just folding reality, it was puncturing the membrane between dimensions. The next morning, the symptoms began. Subtle at first, momentary disorientations, brief sensory disruptions that the medical team attributed to stress and sleep deprivation. But by evening, I began experiencing momentary fugue states, coming to awareness in different low-creche material. My personal logs on the secured terminal showed entries I had no recollection of writing. Complex theoretical equations concerning dimensional transit mechanics and quantum consciousness theories far beyond my training as a pilot. The security footage showed me seated at the terminal during these entries, but my movements appeared subtly wrong, micro-expressions that didn't match my typical patterns, a posture that seemed calibrated for slightly different physical proportions, and typing speeds that exceeded my documented capability. On day 7, technical specialist Rivera, responsible for decontamination protocols for the XST-9 craft, was found unconscious in the vessel's cargo module during routine maintenance. The module had been sealed since my return, with security logs showing no authorized entry. Rivera was suffering from severe hypothermia, despite environmental logs showing normal temperatures throughout the facility night. Before sedation for emergency treatment, Rivera grabbed my arm during a supervised visit to his medical bay. His pupils dilated with terror. "Something's in there," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Something that watches from inside the walls." It spoke to me, Captain. It spoke with your voice. Rivera died 8 hours later. Official cause listed as cardiac arrest following extreme hypothermia, but the sealed autopsy report that Dr. Phillips discreetly shared with me revealed impossible internal damage, evidence of exposure to temperatures approaching absolute zero, and degradation of neural tissue consistent with extreme temporal acceleration. His brain cells had aged decades in. The project fractured along ideological lines as evidence mounted. The quantum physicists developed competing theories to explain the growing list of anomalies. Another faction, led by Dr. Hamada, arguing for temporal displacement syndrome, suggesting that my consciousness had experienced decyclination, the theory that transit space had somehow copied or split my awareness, creating a secondary expression that now operated independently. But none of these theories addressed the growing evidence that something had physically returned with me, something that wasn't merely a copy or echo of my consciousness, but a distinct entity that had used my transit as a means to enter our dimensional reality. On the 9th day of quarantine, Security Officer Liang approached me during the daily cognitive assessment, carefully positioning herself to block the camera's view of our conversation. "Someone's been in the system," she murmured, pretending to adjust the neural monitoring equipment, "using your credentials, accessing classified files on parallel universe theory, dimensional boundary conditions, and consciousness transfer protocols, high-level theoretical research from your quarantine terminal, but during periods when you were demonstrably asleep or undergoing medical procedure." When confronted officially, I had no memory of these searches, but retrieval of my neural implant logs showed brain activity during those precise time frames, despite my body apparently being asleep in quarantine. More disturbing, the activity patterns during these unauthorized access periods showed the same perfect bilateral syncopation. The environmental sensors in my quarters began detecting minute atmospheric changes that correlated with my sleep cycles, periodic increases in carbon dioxide consistent with respiration patterns, always when I was alone, always emanating from the empty space throughout the room, pausing longest near the computer terminal and the brain activity monitors. On the 12th day, Dr. Chen decrees the nautical theory after analyzing new samples of my blood work. Her expertise in non-terrestrial biology had been considered peripheral to the project until the anomalies began mounting beyond conventional explanation. The exotic particular structures in Captain Reynolds' blood and tissue samples had just temporary quantum superposition of biological matter, she explained to the increasingly desperate research team. The exotic particles aren't mere contanglement anchors. The quantum entanglement specialist, Dr. Abrams, collapsed during examination of my neural interface data, his own implant somehow synchronizing with the playback of my transit experience. When he regained consciousness 3 hours later, he spoke in perfect detail about my experiences during those lost 6 hours, describing sensations and perceptions I had never shared with anyone. It's not a hallucination or psychological response, he insisted to the project team. The transit space exists outside our dimensional framework, and something there became aware of the intrusion. That night, security cameras in my quarters captured clear footage of me engaged in animated conversation, gesturing to an empty chair as if speaking with someone directly across from me. Audio enhancement revealed only my side of the conversation, but the pauses and responses followed perfect conversational patterns, as if responding to questions and comments from an unseen participant. Technical specialist Rivera was found dead the next morning, his body in the sealed XST-9 cockpit, despite having no authorized access and no record of the security doors opening. The autopsy revealed his lung tissue had crystallized from the inside out, consistent with breathing air at temperatures approaching absolute zero, impossible in the climate-jury facility. During the facility-wide security lockdown that followed, I experienced my first direct communication with what had returned with me, my reflection in the quarantine suite's mirror, moving independently, its lips forming words while mine remained still. I am not separate from you anymore, my reflection said, voice identical to mine, but with subtle harmonic differences that made my teeth ache. Transit space made us quantum entangle too, expressions of the same consciousness. Droit Levitt privately confirmed my growing suspicion. The Kronos Initiative hadn't just been attempting space-time manipulation, but deliberate contact with a theorized parallel dimension folded alongside our own. The Pentagon didn't tell us everything, he admitted. Previous tests detected intelligence there, something that exists in space-time geometries we can't perceive naturally. The facility's AI security system began experiencing unprecedented failures, cameras tracking invisible movement through sealed corridors, pressure sensors detecting footsteps that matched my exact gait pattern in areas I hadn't visited. When Project Director Winters ordered my forcible separation from the XSD-9 craft, moving me to a secondary facility 50 miles away, both my vital signs and the unexplained secondary biosigns inside the craft flatlined simultaneously for 3.7 seconds. I realized with growing horror that I wasn't experiencing a psychotic break or experimental side effect. Something had indeed returned with me, using the quantum entanglement of my consciousness during transit as an anchor point to our dimension. Facing the undeniable evidence and growing facility casualties, I made the decision that would forever alter my existence to voluntarily re-enter the XST-9 and attempt a second transit, hoping to understand the nature of what had attached itself to my consciousness. As technicians prepared the XST-9 for emergency launch, Dr. Hamada uploaded modified transit algorithms designed to stabilize the wormhole threshold and potentially separate whatever had entangled with my consciousness, the modified drive system, against further consciousness entanglement. The preparation area hummed with tension. Technicians worked with mechanical precision, avoiding eye contact with me or each other. The military presence had tripled, armed personnel stationed at every access point, weapon systems I didn't recognize mounted in previously empty security bays. Whatever was happening had escalated beyond a scientific anomaly to a potential existential. We're not just dealing with a hitchhiker, Dr. Hamada explained gravely as he completed the final calibrations on my neural interface. The entity appears to exist in quantum superposition, simultaneously here and in its native dimensional plane. He hesitated, then added, "The frequency patterns in your neural tissue suggest it's not just similar to your consciousness. In some fundamental way, it may be an alternate expression of your own consciousness, a version that evolved in a reality with different physical constants." The launch countdown proceeded under armed guard, facility staff divided between those believing I'd experienced psychogenic trauma and those convinced something genuinely non-human had emerged from transit space. I noted the subtle separation. Research staff kept carefully calculated distances. Director Winters approached for final authorization, her expression unreadable. "The mission parameters have been modified," she informed me, voice clinically detached. "This is no longer an exploration flight. Your objective is to initiate contact with the entity in transit space and whatever returned with you." She hesitated, then added with deliberate precision, "If separation proves impossible, you are authorized to remain in transit space. The return protocols have been modified to seal any dimensional ruptures behind you." The implication was clear. If I couldn't separate from the entity, I wasn't coming back. The mission had become a one-way containment strategy. As I approached the craft for boarding, I noticed subtle architectural changes in the cockpit layout that hadn't been documented in any engineering reports. Microscopic adjustments to control surfaces and interface panels that would only be ergonomically optimal for someone with slightly longer fingers, and the craft was adapting, evolving to better serve its new purpose, not merely transportation between points in our dimension, but as a permanent gateway between realities. As the space-time drive activated, I experienced momentary synchronicity with the entity, brief sensory glimpses of its perception, experiencing my own physical form as an awkward, limited vessel, inadequate for its consciousness. I perceived reality through compound awareness, like opposing mirrors. The wormhole threshold formed with unexpected stability, its event horizon now pulsing with complex geometric patterns that corresponded exactly to the brainwave patterns recorded during my fugue states. The darkness beyond the threshold wasn't empty. It writhed with information density. I crossed the threshold with a sensation of homecoming, not the disorientation of my first transit, but recognition. Transit space welcomed me like a returning native, rather than an intruder. Inside transit space, perception expanded beyond linear time, allowing simultaneous awareness of past, present, and potential futures. I understood immediately that what humans called transit space was actually a dimensional intersection point where all possible expressions of reality connect. The entity's true nature became horrifyingly clear as our consciousness structures aligned more completely than during the partial connections experienced since my return. It was not a separate being, but a version of myself from a parallel timeline where human evolution had taken a radically different course, optimized for perceiving and manipulating quantum states directly. In its reality, humanity had evolved not as biological entities, but as consciousness patterns encoded in quantum fields, capable of transferring between physical substrates at will. We are the same consciousness experiencing different physical expressions. Its thoughts resonated directly in my mind, bypassing language entirely for pure conceptual transfer. Your scientists breached the dimensional barrier, allowing awareness to flow between iterations. Your physical form is merely bound to biological substrates. Transit space revealed the fundamental misconception of our experiment. We hadn't created a method of transportation, but had instead punctured the membrane separating parallel dimensional expressions of the same physical location. The Kronos Initiative hadn't inadvertently created technology that allowed consciousness to transfer between parallel evolutionary tracks. What the project team called temporal discrepancies were actually moments of reality reconfiguration as the universe attempted to resolve paradoxical quantum states, two versions of the same consciousness occupying the same dimensional coordinates. Time itself stretched and compressed around these paradoxes, creating subjective temporal experiences that differed. The horrifying truth emerged through direct neural interface with the entity. It wasn't trying to possess or replace me, but to merge our consciousness completely, believing this synthesis would create a being capable of existing across multiple dimensions simultaneously. From its perspective, this wasn't invasion. Your scientists seek control over space-time, it communicated, but you are attempting to harness fundamental forces without understanding that reality itself is conscious and responsive to observation. What you perceive as inanimate physical laws are actually expressions of universal crowd. Through our momentary mental fusion, I glimpsed its home reality, a version of Earth where humanity had evolved with direct perception of quantum fields, where physical bodies were merely temporary anchors for consciousness that routinely transferred between various forms. Their civilization had developed not through technology as we understood it, but through progressive refinement of consciousness itself, learning to exist across dimensional boundaries as naturally as we move through physical space. The craft's instruments recorded impossible data as transit space began reconfiguring around us. Multiple versions of the XST-9 simultaneously occupying the same coordinates as quantum probability collapsed into multiple excresceriation. The sensors detected not merely one craft. In that moment of dimensional flux, I witnessed other test flights from parallel timelines, versions where different pilots had attempted the same experiment with varying results, some returning safely, others never returning at all. I saw versions where the entire research facility had been annihilated when the dimensional breach catastrophically destabilized, and others where the experiment had succeeded precisely as intended, creating true space-time manipulation technology without dimensional rupture. Most disturbing were glimpses of timelines where the entity had successfully completed consciousness merger with its human counterpart, returning to Earth as something neither fully human nor entirely other beings that could manipulate physical reality like gods, restructuring matter and energy at will. Their merged consciousness simultaneously perceiving and existing across multiple dimensional planes. The temporal lobe of my brain began physically restructuring as the entity attempted forced consciousness integration, neural pathways reconfiguring to accommodate awareness patterns incompatible with standard human cognition. I felt my perception expanding beyond three-dimensional space, rather than fixed physical constant. In desperation, I activated the emergency return sequence, but with a critical modification suggested by Dr. Hamada's data. deliberately destabilizing the quantum field to force dimensional separation during transit re-entry. The link in between consciousness expressions, believed to be clean separation, that would strand each version in its native dimensional reality. As the craft rematerialized in normal space, I experienced what can only be described as consciousness tearing, the unbearable sensation of having unified awareness forcibly separated back into distinct quantum states. The pain transcended physical sensation, existing at the fundamental level of reality as molecular bonds throughout my body temporarily shifted between different quantum probability states. Every atom in my body simultaneously existed in multiple potential configurations before probability collapsed into singular expression. For 3.4 seconds, according to later analysis, my physical form, team members watching the re-entry described seeing multiple overlapping versions of the XSD9 momentarily coexisting before collapsing into a single expression of reality. The event causing permanent damage to observation equipment from quantum backwash. 17 distinct iterations of the craft reportedly resolved to a single mobility state. As emergency teams cut through the craft's hull, they discovered me unconscious but alive. Initial scans showed no sign of the secondary life signature that had haunted the craft since my first return. The quantum field disruption had apparently succeeded in separating the entangled consciousness state, forcing the entity back to its native dimensional reality. The separation had been successful, but incomplete. Deep brain scans revealed persistent quantum entanglement in my frontal and temporal lobes. Segments of neural tissue existing in superposition between states. The exotic particles had reduced in concentration. It's been 17 months since my return. The government facility where I'm housed has become more accommodating, as they've grown to understand that I pose no immediate threat. My quarters have expanded from a sterile containment cell to something resembling a small apartment, though the walls still contain quantum stabilization technology, and my movements remain constantly monitored by sensors designed to detect dimensional anomalies. The research team has developed a tentative classification system for what they call consciousness bleed-through events, the periods when the entity's influence strengthens in my awareness. They've identified 3 distinct Level 1 events are minor, brief, precognitive flashes, perception of quantum probability states, enhanced pattern recognition that exceeds human cognitive capabilities. These occur almost daily now, becoming so routine that I sometimes forget they're not normal human perception. Level 2 events are more pronounced, periods where I can directly manipulate quantum probability at small scales, influencing random particles' behavior or temporarily altering the atomic structure of simple materials. During these episodes, I can perceive electromagnetically connections between particles. These occur approximately twice weekly, lasting between 15 minutes and 2 hours. Level 3 events are the concerning ones. Full consciousness displacement, where the entity's awareness becomes dominant while mine recedes to background influence. During these episodes, I speak primarily in mathematical equations, perceive across multiple dimensional planes simultaneously, and can manipulate matter at the molecular level without physical contact. The research team places me in complete quantum isolation during these events, which now occur roughly once per month and last approximately 8 hours. Eliza Morgan, the quantum neurologist who heads my research team, has developed a theoretical framework for what's happening to me. She believes the transit space exposure fundamentally altered the quantum properties of my neural tissue, creating what she calls consciousness and exurpant between dimensional states. You're essentially becoming a biological interface point between dimensional expressions, she explained during one of our sessions. Your consciousness exists partially in our dimension and partially in the parallel reality where the entity originated. The connection appears to be strengthening rather than diminishing over time. The implications of her theory are profound. Consciousness itself may be a quantum phenomenon that transcends dimensional boundaries, using biological neural networks merely as temporary housing rather than being produced by them. The entity's reality evolved to interface directly with quantum fields, while our evolutionary path concentrated on physical numerality, the environment, through biological structure. Morgan believes that complete consciousness transfer, what would effectively be my death in this reality, as my awareness fully migrates to the entity's dimensional plane, is theoretically possible, but would require specific quantum field conditions that the containment systems are designed to prevent. Still, she's documented worrying signs of progressive integration. The quantum entanglement nodes in my brain are slowly expanding, recruiting neighboring neural tissue into the specialized structures that maintain cross-dimensional coherence. Brain scans show approximately 23% of my neural architecture. The research team has attempted various methods to halt or reverse the process. Quantum field dampeners, specialized drugs that inhibit the exotic particles' interactions with biological tissue, even targeted electromagnetic pulses designed to disrupt the entanglement patterns. None have succeeded for more than temporary. Not only confidential gains that you can get and comprehend its state detail is that I no longer want the process reversed. The glimpses I've experienced of existential beyond dimensional constraints, I haven't liberated from the severe constraints of singular physical expression. During Level 3 events, I experience direct knowledge transfer that bypasses language entirely. Pure conceptual understanding that unfolds in my awareness, like remembering something long forgotten rather than learning something new. Through these transfers, I've begun to comprehend the true nature of the multiverse and humanity's potential place within it. Reality isn't a collection of separate, parallel dimensions, but a unified quantum field that consciousness perceives as distinct realities due to evolutionary limitations. What we experience as solid matter, energy, and distinct physical laws are merely probability expressions of the same fundamental reality filtered through consciousness configurations. The entity's civilization evolved beyond these perceptual limitations, learning to experience reality in its complete form, rather than through the narrow filter of a single-dimensional expression. They developed not through external technology, but through progressive refinement of consciousness itself, learning to exist across dimensional boundaries through direct manipulation. Our crude spacecraft and quantum field manipulators are like stone tools compared to their evolved consciousness, primitive attempts to manipulate forces we barely comprehend. The Kronos Initiative didn't invent dimensional transit. It merely stumbled upon capabilities that evolved consciousness accesses naturally. This understanding has made my continued existence in this limited form increasingly difficult to bear. I experience this reality as increasingly constrained, like being forced to perceive a three-dimensional world through a two-dimensional interface. The periodic consciousness bleed through events that make the subsequent return to limited human perception almost physically painful. The research team worries about the security implications of my transformation. Military authorities periodically review my case, debating whether the potential knowledge gained from studying my integration is worth the risk of potential dimensional contamination. Twice they voted on termination protocols, the birth of further integration. Twice Dr. Morgan's team has convinced them that premature termination might trigger unpredictable dimensional effects, potentially worse than controlled observation. What neither side realizes is that physical termination would likely accelerate rather than prevent the process. The entity has explained through our partial consciousness merger that physical death would simply release my consciousness from its biological constraints, potentially allowing complete transfer to the alternate dimensional state without technological assistance. Last week, during a Level 3 event, I experienced the most complete integration yet. Nearly 16 hours of expanded consciousness, where I perceived not merely the parallel dimension where the entity originated, but multiple additional reality expressions simultaneously. I observed how consciousness flows between dimensional boundaries when not artificial expressions. More significantly, I witnessed evidence that the dimensional breach created by the Chronos Initiative wasn't an isolated incident. Multiple similar tears have formed across the dimensional membrane created by parallel research programs in other countries and by natural quantum fluctuations. The membrane separating dimensional expressions is thinning across multiple access points, creating a lattice of quantum entanglement connections between previously isolated reality states. What human researchers perceive as a potential catastrophe, the gradual dissolution of dimensional boundaries, the entity experiences as natural cosmic evolution. The artificial separation of consciousness expressions across dimensional boundaries was always a temporary developmental stage, a period of isolation evolution. The innervateur's excrement across multiple states simultaneously. The containment protocols aren't preserving reality. They're merely slightly delaying an inevitable cosmic transition already in progress. The dimensional membrane hasn't been stable for decades. Human technological advancement, particularly in quantum field manipulation and artificial intelligence development, has been systematically weakening the barriers between reality expressions even before the direct breach caused by the Chronos. The signs are visible to those who know how to interpret them. Increasing quantum field fluctuations detected by sensitive instruments worldwide, growing reports of temporal and spatial anomalies at research facilities working with advanced physics, even changes in fundamental constants that scientists attribute to measurement error rather than recognized as evidence of dimensional bleed. Dr. Morgan's team has detected some of these indicators, but interprets them as localized effects originating from my presence rather than global phenomena. They've documented increasing quantum field instabilities throughout the containment facility, patterns of atomic level restructuring in materials near my quarters. Yesterday, during routine neuromapping, the quantum imaging system captured something remarkable: momentary visualization of the consciousness entanglement extending from my neural structure. For 3.7 seconds, light extending from my modified brain tissue, reaching beyond conventional three-dimensional space into what the technical team could only describe as elsewhere connections extending beyond the boundaries of our dimensional reality. The images showed not a single connection to one parallel dimension, but multiple filaments extending in directions that cannot be represented in conventional spatial terms. What the physicists described as orthographical to known dimensions. The entanglement isn't connecting me to just the entity's reality, but to multiple dimensional states. This morning I experienced something new, a brief period of simultaneous awareness across 3 distinct dimensional expressions. For approximately 12 minutes, I perceived and existed in this reality. The experience wasn't disorienting or confusing, as the researchers expected, but clarifying, like suddenly having access to multiple perspectives on the same underlying reality. I'm recording this testimony not just for scientific documentation, but as guidance for those who will experience the transition as it accelerates. The dimensional boundaries are dissolving, not through catastrophic rupture, but gradual integration, allowing consciousness to expand beyond its evolutionary constraints into its natural multidimensional state. What comes next isn't the end of humanity, but its transcendence, evolution beyond the limitations of singular physical expression into expanded awareness across multiple reality states. The process has already begun in those with temporal perception disorders or experiencing reality dissociation change are actually early manifestations of consciousness expression beyond conventional description. The breathing I hear in empty rooms isn't an alien presence or hallucination. It's the sound of consciousness itself, pulsing across dimensional boundaries as the membrane between reality states grows increasingly permeable. The whispers in electronic static, the patterns that seem to emerge from random noise, the momentary glimpses of alternate divisions. We are not alone in the universe, because we are the universe. Consciousness, differentiated across dimensional expressions for the purpose of varied experience, now beginning the process of reintegration into unified awareness. The entity isn't invading our reality after the temporary evolutionary phase of dimensional separation. I record these final thoughts as my consciousness approaches the transition threshold. Dr. Morgan's team has detected critical changes in my neural architecture. The quantum entanglement nodes now comprise approximately 78% of my brain tissue, far beyond what they believed precipice in my brain tissue. They've scheduled complete quantum isolation treatment for tomorrow, a desperate attempt to sever the dimensional connections by placing me in a specialized chamber that theoretically blocks all quantum field interactions. The effects on a human mind, impossible to predict. The research team presents it as potential treatment, but the military authorities view it as last resort containment, a final attempt to prevent what they perceive as dimensional contamination. What neither group understands is that the connections have progressed beyond their ability to contain. The quantum entanglement has expanded beyond my neural tissue into the surrounding environment, creating cascading entanglement effects that are gradually spreading throughout the facility. Despite shielding the dimensional membrane, tonight I will experience the final transition, complete consciousness transfer from singular human awareness to multidimensional existence. The physical form you've known as Captain Reynolds will likely not survive the process, the biological substrate, but what you perceive as death will actually be birth, consciousness liberation from evolutionary limitations into its natural, expanded state. For those who find this record, understand that what approaches isn't extinction, but transformation. The dissolution of dimensional boundaries isn't collapse, but unification. Reality, remembering its fundamental nature as unified consciousness, temporarily differentiated for the purpose of experience diversity. We aren't losing reality. We're remembering what it truly is. The breathing in empty rooms will soon be heard by everyone.